So, hello, welcome back. I hope that you loved the documentary as much as I did. I think you'll agree, these young people, if they are the future, we are in amazing hands. I'm really excited to start this next session with two people who I hold very dear in terms of they're kind of inspirational to me for a variety of reasons. And you'll see that as we start to have these conversations. But I'm really excited to introduce two women who have been in this space for a long time, who've been in the space of managing talent, identifying talent, placing talent, both through their kind of corporate roles as leaders, but also now in different spaces, which they will talk about. I'd like to introduce first Moula Mokhobo-Amegashie, one of my very good friends, Johannesburg, South Africa, and Valerie Rainford, who is, which city are you in, Valerie? Because you could be anywhere, knowing you. You could be in Florida. Are you in Florida or New York? Okay, you're in Florida right now. Who is in Florida, and me, who is sitting in Washington, D.C. Today, we're going to talk about the myth. Well, I think it's a myth that diverse talent, Black talent, talent of color is hard to find. I think it depends on what lens you're looking through, but we're going to have a bit of a conversation about that and really start to examine, I think, strategies for how you might find that talent, but also our experiences, the three of us on this panel, around why we don't necessarily believe that to be true. So, Valerie, welcome. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So I've spent 30 some odd years in corporate America, the first 21 at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and the last 12 to 13 at JP Morgan. I would say the theme of my career was change agent. So I was always on the business side, managing a business, but in my spare time, as most people do, I was executive sponsor for something diversity related. So at the Federal Reserve, when I was there, I was actually running corporate real estate at the time, advocated for the first women's groups, helped hire the first chief diversity officer, did my first assignment around diversity analytics. I was always very curious around the numbers and representation of diversity. I was recruited to JP Morgan with that change management skills. So I joined right before the financial services industry collapsed and worked on everything from the Bear Stearns acquisition, WAMU acquisition, the Lehman going bankrupt with JP Morgan Chase as one of its largest creditors. And all along the way, I was also executive sponsor for diversity. And about 4 years ago, when the chairman decided, pre-George Floyd, decided that we needed to do more for Black talent inside the company, he established a role, said he was not looking for a diversity or an HR person, but a problem solver. And it was a perfect role for me. So I created and led for 3.5 years JP Morgan Chase's Advancing Black Leaders Strategy. 3 years in, we were breaking records. We had increased more Black executives on Wall Street than all five of our competitors combined. And I started going out and talking to our clients, trying to share what we were doing. And I saw interest from those clients and wanting to replicate some of the practices that we had uncovered to identify diverse talent. And it became clear to me that there were more companies that wanted to do the same. And so I started my own consulting firm, Elloree Talent Strategies, and now I advise CEOs and boards across multiple companies on how to establish strategies that advance all diverse talent, but with a specific expertise and focus on Black talent.
I had to put my microphone on. This is the second time I've done that today, by the way. I'm trying to be quiet. You know, we'll apologize in advance if you hear a dog bark or a child scream. It could happen. I think that we're all living in that environment, perhaps where there are distractions and people. So I muted my mic. So sorry about that. Um, but I wanted to just kind of set again the frame a bit for this. So I'd like to talk about the changes that you've witnessed as a result of George Floyd, but I think there's been a tide shift. I mean, Valerie, you talked about the fact that 4 years ago, when you were at JP Morgan, there was already a conversation about how you ensure that you attract and retain more senior Black talent, for example, but the Black talent more holistically as well. Um, but I want to talk about how things are changing, the changes in structure, right? The willingness to have conversations that we weren't able to have before. The opportunity, for example, for Black talent and talent of color to flourish at a time when, frankly, they're very sought after on a number of fronts. And then I think the other thing is, again, this is just in framing, is avoiding the pitfall of tokenism, right? Because,
Mm-hmm.
Black talent in this moment is so sought after. It is really important to identify why you're doing a role and why they want that role, particularly in the CDO space, the Chief Diversity Officer space, where we have seen a gazillion appointments in the last 4 months, right? And
That's
so
right.
I'm going to start, Valerie, by asking you. You were running advancing Black talent at JP Morgan for a number of years, and you did manage to significantly change the landscape of what senior Black talent, especially, looked like at JP Morgan. Can you talk to us a little bit about the strategies that you used and what your philosophy was as you thought about how you were going to step into that?
Yeah, and I would say, so we actually moved the needle across all levels. Most people focus on what happened at the top because it was so unique, but we also moved Black students from 5% of the incoming population to 13.5%. And I would say to you that the most important thing in any organization is the commitment of the CEO. And I would say, lots of people talk about the tone from the top, but it takes more than tone. It takes conviction. It takes the CEO that does more than just lays out a vision, but puts his money where his mouth is, number one, but also carries it through to everything that you do. And so, I say to my clients today, I won't take a client if I can't get a meeting with the CEO, right? That to not be able to sit with the CEO and understand what their vision is and how much they're willing to put their own skin on the line, to me, says everything about where a company is ready to go. So if I'm talking to someone and, it typically takes a couple of conversations to get there. And when it's time so when do we get to schedule the meeting with the CEO? If the individuals who are courting me to consult with them don't have the ability to bring the CEO to the table, that's the first thing. And I would say for folks who are jumping on these jobs at the CDO level, like, use the same for you. So first was, where is the leader in the journey? Many don't know what they want to or need to do, but are willing to learn. That's good enough for me. And then the second there were a couple of things that I think were the secret sauce for our success, but I think a second thing was grounding all of our actions in data. So I think there are plenty of organizations that are out there trying to or talking about moving the needle around diversity. They don't know where their unique challenges are. So knowing where the gaps are specifically, creating success measures around those gaps and driving your solutions in that space is really pretty clear. And maybe if I gave you a third, one of my secret recipes, and it's intentionality, right? Like, someone's got to own the strategy. And typically, and meaning someone who's a business leader needs to own the strategy. Typically, diversity and or Black talent strategies today are being put on the shoulders of chief diversity officers who have a lot to do and also don't have the power to get it done. So those are three of the things that I think were the difference makers for us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. And, Moula, I know that you have very similar experience in terms of what you've seen, particularly having been in search. Um, I'd like to kind of talk to you about, you're the managing partner of your firm. How's the candidate profile changed in terms of what people are asking for? Because, the ramifications of George Floyd's death kind of traveled across the world in terms of the people paying attention and having conversations they hadn't before. And I know that in South Africa, it's no different, right? Your history, the history of kind of apartheid in South Africa, and working on the other side of that. And then, being a still relevant country on the other 25 years or, coming close to 30 years, it's still very young in being able to kind of move through that. So when you think about you, right, and you think about your experience, can we talk a little bit about the issues of transformation, especially with regards to race and gender, and how high they are on the agenda for South Africa, and how organizations have fared with regard to attracting and retaining Black executives? Does the myth that a competent Black talent is non-existent still thrive there?
I think the myth thrives very, very strongly. There's a perception that there is no competent Black executives around. And I think because South Africa, leadership positions are still largely held by white males, both at board level and senior executive level, policies and practices are put into place to support and promote attracting competent Black executives to join companies. But essentially, the people who still run the companies in my country are largely white and male. So I think in support of what Valerie said, if you're looking at it in terms of your role and responsibility as chief executive to the talent pool, and you own it and you buy it and you support it and you sponsor it, it happens. If you look at it as a threat to your own existence, it doesn't happen, because then it really, really supports your view that you're going to perpetuate the myth that Black competent skill does not exist. But I think another interesting advent in South Africa particularly is also the perception that competent Black executives sometimes are too confident, sometimes are too demanding, sometimes are too opinionated. And so there's a blanket statement that sometimes gets to us as headhunters that we want them to be very competent, but there must be a cultural fit. And cultural fit is a code for know your place. So be a great chartered accountant, be a great engineer, be a great operator, and be a great executive, but don't rock the boat. And so it always becomes very interesting where you actually find the technical competence that is not dependent on whether you're male or female or Black or white. And then the big issue becomes integration into companies, where sometimes there's tissue rejection. And because you are confident and you are competent and you do have choice and you are going to speak your mind and you are going to put your opinion across, the organizations reject in the sense that, you're not a cultural fit. And that cultural fit never really gets broken down. So it then becomes a bit of a barrier in terms of having competent Black executives stay in companies. And so I think the onus largely lies, in my opinion, in two particular places. One, to Valerie's point, with the chief executive, and two, for me, is with the chairman. When you have a competent chairman, I believe, who is competent in terms of ensuring that they hold the executives accountable to finding competent executives, it's important. The other overlay for me as well is that sometimes you find companies that advise, particularly in the private sector, hunting companies that advise companies and will tell you that there are no competent Black executives. And you find largely those headhunting companies are white headhunting companies. It serves their purposes to perpetuate the myth that there aren't enough Black people that are competent. So I always say it's a question of who you partner with to help you find the best skill, who you let lead the charge to find the Black skill. And I think the chairman and the chief executive are absolutely fundamental in making sure that we begin to transform, both from a race perspective, a gender perspective, an age perspective, a language perspective. In South Africa and in Africa broadly, I'd go as far as to say, and a tribal perspective, because whether we like to admit it or not, we still have some of these tribal tendencies on the continent. How do we look at inclusion, not just in terms of gender and sexual orientation, but also in terms of social-political background, in terms of tribal issues, in terms of language, in terms of age, and in terms of rural and urban? So it's quite an interesting, I think, paradigm in terms of looking beyond what we think is obvious. There are very, very competent Black people. Your question is, are you wanting to find them? And then if, in conclusion, I think when you find competent Black executives, they cost too much. When you find Black competent executives, they don't stay too long. So that's another myth. We recruit them, we train them, they come for more money, and then they leave. And that's an absolute fallacy. Because if you belong, if you're looked after, if you're grown, and if you're supported, you're going to stay.
Absolutely. The two of you kind of summed up everything in a very short period of time. You've touched on a lot of things that I'd like to dig a little deeper into. And I think one of the things that popped in, as Moula, you were speaking, we were talking about the executives. It was really interesting, Valerie, because one of the things that you mentioned was that you managed to move the incoming kind of population, the kind of more junior population, the kind of student population from 5% to 13.5%, which is in line with the national average, right? The average of the number of people in the country, which is very interesting in terms of how you did that. I'd like to kind of dig into.
India, can I ask, can you make your next question to Moula? I just need to step away for a second. Okay.
Absolutely. So Moula, I'm going to come back to you, and I'll kind of tap on something that you talked about, and that's around the fallacy. Okay, so the fallacy of particularly, I think the overconfidence piece that sat with me because it's something that I heard about myself as an executive, kind of bull in China shop, and I wasn't. I don't think I was. Maybe I was. But there's some cultural context to that. But also, I felt very confident that I knew what I was doing, very confident that I could lead, and that I deserved the seat at the table that I was, at which I was sitting. So, what are the kinds of things that you talk to your not the people that are not the companies, but when you're talking to candidates, right, about the decisions they make around cultural fit for them, because the company says, hey, this may not be a cultural fit, but there's also the other side of that as a candidate, right? You assessing. What are some of the assessment tools that you would ask people to consider when they're thinking about taking a role, kind of going to that tokenism thing, but also understanding some of the pitfalls they might face around some of the things that you talked about?
And that's an interesting question, because I think one of the issues is that I think there's a lot of Black executives in South Africa particularly are fatigued about being the first Black. So they are at a point where they say, I don't want to be the first one to be the guinea pig to see whether the organization is going to hire me, grow me, invest in me, and allow me to demonstrate what I'm competent to do. So increasingly, a lot of Black executives are mixes about the fact that are there any other people at group level that look like me? Are there other people at board level that look like me, both in terms of cultural experience, background, race, and gender? And increasingly, when you're going to be the first one, who's going to be the first Black person at group executive level with a team of largely white men and a few women, a lot of candidates are making choices that they don't want to do it. And so that then becomes a bit of a surprise when companies are happy to get Black executives, and Black executives say, well, I don't want to be the first Black, and I don't want to be the guinea pig. I've done it for most of my career. And frankly, I'd like to join a company. You've already demonstrated that you have done this, and I'm not the first one to be your experiment. Because I know the pain of having to change perceptions. I know what it's taken out of me personally, both emotionally, professionally, and otherwise, to just prove to you that I'm actually worthy of being here. because it's not just about performing and knowing that I have the right education, the right background, but it's the daily struggle of having to prove to everybody every single day that I belong here. And so that becomes a bit of a difficult one as a headhunter, because we have a lot of companies that are really pushing to attract competent Black executives into very technical positions. So if I look at NTs and just before democracy, when my mother and her peers were getting into the work environment, Black people were traditionally hired into the softer competency areas. So that would be corporate affairs or human resources or transformation. There used to be a big role called transformation in those days, which basically was a role around, how do we get Black and white people to understand each other and work together. And so we don't see the role of transformation that much anymore. And so if I look at it between now and going forward, a lot more companies now are hiring people for what they should be them for technical expertise. You're looking for engineers, you're looking for chartered accountants, you're looking for lawyers, you're looking for operators, you're looking for technical experts. And so now we're at a point where white South Africa, I think corporate white South Africa is beginning to look for technical expertise that are not white male or white female. But we just did some research with Drayton the other day. Usually that'll happen when the chief executive or the chairman is Black. And in more cases than not, chairmen are normally Black and chief executives are normally white. So if you have a very strong chairman, and strong in the sense of competence, confidence, has a vested interest in transforming and leaving a legacy of a competent company, a highly performing driven company, because sometimes I think we forget that it's not just about color, race, and gender, but it's about commercial success. So you want to have a commercial organization that also happens to be very diverse in gender, age, and the rest. So when you have competent chairmen that are technically astute, confident, competent, and are willing to really push the organizations to transform, you typically find that those competent chairmen, and I use chairman loosely as in men or women, will then make sure that you hire best class, strongly qualified Black executives into senior positions. And usually they'll provide the buffer to make sure that they don't get intimidated or bullied when they get into positions and they forget their place and they speak out of turn. They really begin to shake up things and ask for their place at the table.
I love, that's something that we certainly need to talk about in the next. I'm going to go to Valerie for a second, but I want to come back to that because there is something about, and I'm not necessarily a fan of the word sponsorship. To some extent, it kind of frustrates me, but there is something about having folks who are prepared to lend their voice on your behalf and ensure what you experience is, or that you have the support to make the decisions that you need to make. It's kind of supporting your leadership. And that's really important because that is a problem that I think a lot of senior Black executives find when they get into organizations, get into these roles, and then don't have the support around them to be able to make the decisions they need to make or for them to be executed in the way that they would have seen fit. So I do want to come back to that. Valerie, we're going to go back to you. I'd like to go back to, you were talking about the fact that you were able to move the student population from 5% to 13.5% when you talk about bringing people in, which is pretty important in terms of thinking about pipeline, right? So my question for you is twofold. The first one is how you actually made that, what are some of the things you did to get from 5 to 13.5%? The second thing is what do you need to do to retain those people so they become a part of a valid pipeline of leadership into the organization over time? Because people come in, but how do you keep them? So I'll leave that with you to see what you have to say about that.
Yeah. So first, I want to come back to this point that I made about data analysis. Because when I say it, oftentimes it needs more explanation, right? Most big people, when they hear me say that, they talk about diversity representation reports. And I'm talking about measuring the experience of diverse talent. So for instance, when we go into a client, we're looking to see what the experience is of individuals in the organization. In the case of the Black student increase at JP Morgan, the first thing we did was we started to read some of the reviews, right? Like, that's data. What are the reviews saying about what these students were experiencing? And there was this recurring theme of, well, they're not a great fit, right? So either when in the application process, something about them is a not nice fit. They come in for internship, that it's not the right fit. And so we really went about trying to figure out, like, what did that statement mean? Oftentimes the theme and the feedback was that they were not assertive enough. So we created a student orientation program. Every student that was offered a internship at JP Morgan was invited to a 2-day orientation program before the internship began. We flew them to Brooklyn, New York, put them up in, for some of these students, they had never been on a plane before, but we flew them to a location, brought them together, and put an orientation program so that they got comfortable with the company and the environment before they arrived. That we talked to them about what to expect before they arrived. We had them meet with members of the team, each other as well as members of the team before they arrived. And it's amazing how giving them sort of that sense of what the company is before they even got there made a huge difference. In addition to bringing them together as a group, we then broke them out into small groups for the specific businesses that they would join, so that they learn about the business in advance. Because many of these students are coming up in high schools where in families where they did not have these generational conversations around wealth and money and banking and so on. So that was one example. The other thing that we did, so as they didn't end the summer not knowing if they fit or not, is they had a buddy all summer long, right? They had and by the way, it was generally someone in the company who either it could have been a senior person who volunteered to be a resource for them, because oftentimes what happened is they would be experiencing some microaggression along the way that they were holding in and not really expressing their thoughts on. So that was in one respect. But I do think, just coming back to this larger, how you can quantify and analyze the entire experience for Black people. A call that I just had with a client this morning, all of it, we said to them, like, here's a population of Black people who did not even make it to the second step with recruiting, and here's what their skill sets look like. How could they not have been qualified for these roles, right? Here's the population of people who got the first interview but didn't get a second interview. Here's a population of people who are stuck inside of your organization. They're performing consistently well, but yet they're waiting longer than the average time to promotion, or they're not getting. Here's a population of people who have strong performance, but they've never, been in the ideal jobs, right? And so that's what we currently do. And I contend that if you look at any level of population and look to the analytics of what their experience is, you would know right away what you need to do in order to improve the situation for them. And finally, I'd say, again, on the client call that I had this morning, almost 1,000 people who in the systems are rated as top talent Black performers, and laying out for them the different things that are holding those 1,000 people back at every level. If P&L is something you have to have in order to move forward in an organization, not having P&L is something that you should be aware of, right? If they are your best talent, but yet they can't get the best roles, like, it's not that hard to figure out how to solve for some of these, and the talent is right underneath the noses.
That's, it was really interesting because one of the things that Moula said, which was interesting, I mean, one extreme to the other in terms of where you are in your career. Moula, we were talking about confidence, people saying that sometimes Black executives appear overly confident in certain spaces. That's something that she'd experienced. And the words cultural fit around that confidence. And then you were talking about on the other end, what the feedback around what they were saying more junior Black people are like in these spaces, which are complete opposite ends of the spectrum. Now, obviously, the more senior you become, the more confident you become because of a number of different things. But it's so interesting to hear the difference between those two things independently almost as we kind of sit in those spaces. So let me go back to you, Moula, because I wanted to kind of touch on this thing that we were talking that you were talking about. I want to now I asked you about candidates. I now want to go to kind of companies and corporations, and you talked about the importance of CEOs and chairmen and them being committed. Particularly kind of given the environment that we're in now, are you seeing shifts? Because that's an expectation that I suspect, kind of knowing you, that you will have always had around chairmen and CEOs and placing your candidates, because that's just kind of how I know you do operate. But have you seen specific shifts as a result of the environment that we're in now? Are you seeing requests for more Black talent, or people wanting to find more Black talent, or is that not something that's happening as much in South Africa?
I think the push to find more Black talent is a given. So I think all companies, private or public sector, have a very real requirement to find Black talent. So that is an ongoing conversation across all sectors in this country. And it's one that I think is a very important one we need to keep at, because we tend to lag behind in the private sector, particularly statistically. If you look at the numbers, if you look at the top listed companies in South Africa, less than 5% of them are run by Black chief executives. So we have a long way to go in terms of getting competent Black executives to be in prime leadership positions in running these multinational big companies. And so I think that's an issue that's going to be on the agenda for a very, very long time in terms of race, and then obviously secondarily in terms of gender. I think boards are transforming faster. So you're finding a lot more representation at board level in terms of finding, when you look at the numbers, finding more representation in terms of gender and race in terms of corporate boards. And I think that is a lever that we really, really have to exercise quite a lot. And I think one of the things you said earlier, India, was about the whole issue of sponsorship. And I think it's one of those that I think we all struggle with quite a lot. So I think one struggles with the fact that on the one hand, you want to prove that you got there by yourself, which is great. But on the other hand, I think sometimes as Black people is that we're scared to say, I need a helping hand. And what do I mean by a helping hand? It doesn't mean that I need a handout. It just means I need somebody else who's going to believe in me to open the door for me to succeed. And I think if we all look at all of our careers, somewhere along the line we had a sponsor. And somewhere along the line we had somebody who let you through the door. And once you got through the door, you could then have earned your right to be in that space. And so I think at board level, one of the key drivers for transformation in my country, quite honestly, is having representation at board level and having boards that really make it imperative that the management teams of those boards are representative in terms of race and gender. So when you have that push that's coming from the board, I think it adds an impetus to making sure that we have more transformed management teams. But the other caveat for me at board level as well is that we've come out of a history where during the transition from apartheid into post-democracy, a lot of board members came from a strong political background. So boards at that point wanted Black people that had ANC credentials that could help them speak to the keys of the Nelson Mandelas, because obviously there was a big divide before. And so there wasn't a big drive in the 90s, particularly, to recruit board members that came from a technical background, who had grown through organizations, because simply there weren't any. because the history of my country precluded that from happening. So you're now finding a change where you're finding boards that are not just looking at people that are politically connected, but you're finding board chairmen and subcommittee members that are technically astute in terms of what they need to do. And so I think as we begin to change the competence and the composition of boards, it will then have a ripple effect of pushing down the issue of transformation to make sure that we also have competent management teams that are technically competent. And obviously the ripple effect then is that you then begin to run highly efficient, profitable, commercially viable organizations. But those organizations have to be relevant in a social, economic, political environment. So the more diverse the company is, both technically and otherwise, the more relevant it is in understanding its markets and understanding its customers, and therefore leading to promoting profitably healthy organizations.
Yes, I mean that is, I mean, the whole conversation about, you know, management teams and boards, leadership teams and boards, the difference between the two. I mean, I think here in the US we're seeing something quite different, where suddenly, as a result of kind of the post George Floyd world, I think I've seen probably 5 appointments of Black people to boards every week, frankly, which was one of the things that drove me to thinking about avoiding the pitfalls of tokenism and and I think that we deserve to be there. Don't get me wrong. And I think we absolutely deserve some of those seats without question. The question is just how quickly it's happening and what that looks like and what that means. So I want to kind of go back, Valerie. There was in the news here in the U.S. and Moula, I'm not sure if you're aware of this or not. There was a big firestorm around Wells Fargo, and a comment that the CEO made, apparently, because I mean, you know, you never know the full stories to all of this. But he apparently said that let's just say that people believed or thought that he said that there wasn't. That Black talent was hard to find, essentially the basis of this whole conversation. I believe he was talking about more senior levels of the organization. And I think to some extent, you know, while people might shoot me for saying it, to some extent that's true. Having been a senior Black executive in a big organization, when I look to the side of me and look down, it didn't look like there was a huge pipeline to me. I'm not saying there's a shortage of talent. I mean, there's something that needs to be done. But if you look at how organizations exist today, that may be true in some cases. Valerie, what are your thoughts just about how we first, you know, do you, in your seat, because again, you were looking at the landscape, you were looking across industry at Black talent when you were talking about how you might shift that for JP Morgan. Did you find that it was hard to find talent? Did you have to change any of the criteria in terms of bringing those people on? Did you have to get people to think about people differently? Or was it just, you know, they didn't know where to look?
Yeah. And I would say even post JP Morgan, it could be industry driven as well, right? There's some industries where there might be a limited pool, but I do think your point that do you have to look at the requirements differently, not lower. No one's asking you to lower the requirements, but looking at them differently. So, for example, one of the things that I encourage there and I encourage my clients to do is think about certain skill sets. So finance being one. We were going after people who had finance skills in banking. You can change how you think about finance, right? And think about someone who's non-finance, and we did that. Maybe they don't come in directly to a CFO role, but they come into a role where they get to know the company, get to learn banking regulations, and can move into a CFO level role. That's just one way to think about it, right? The same often existed when you talk about credit risk roles, right? Is it someone who might have underwriting experience? How do you think about the combination of experiences that they've had? And how do you think about bringing them into the company in a way where they can learn the company, learn the skill set, and move to the role? Those are some of the ways where we sort of busted through the traditional ways that managers often will, here's my rec. If you don't fit my rec, then you don't get the job, right? And I think some of these requisitions are just too rigid. And the second is that oftentimes, particularly at the senior level, when those roles are getting filled, they're getting filled by people that you know. And oftentimes, the recruiters nor the hiring managers know people who look like us, right? So I think it's sourcing differently. Like, where are you going to look for the talent? What restrictions are you taking when you go looking for the talent? And I think to point Moula was making is you can't just go get us. You got to support us once we're there, right? Because the most organizations that I have been in, there's an organic, natural level of support that comes with sameness, right? So the white women are going to throw their arms around the white women who join, right? The guys will throw their support on the golf course or tennis courts, whatever it is they do, to support folks that look like them. But when there aren't enough of us there, who's there to help throw their arms around you? And that's why you need very intentional sponsorship programs, right? The company needs to have onboarding and integration programs that allow folks that we can come in, but when you drop us off to the sideline and expect us to fish on our own, we're smart, but organization cultures will often cause us to be left behind, even the best of us, right? So I think it's a combination of opening up our minds and our requirements. There's no shortage of Black people. There's shortage of opportunity. There's shortage of support. There's shortage of openness. But I don't think there's shortage of us.
Yep. I mean that it's a really interesting dynamic to consider. All of the things that you have to consider as a candidate. I'm taking a candidate side again. When you think about asking the questions around the organization and if it's a good fit for you, right? Because
Right.
part of this, right, as talent, and I'm pretending I'm talent right now. I'm not in the market, just in case anybody's wondering. It's just my saying that. But a part of this as talent is asking the question of yourself around, because people think that the pipe is going to close, right? So all these jobs are out there right now, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff out there right now, particularly in the US and some in the UK, but particularly in the US that I'm experiencing. And the question is the faucet going to turn off, right? Because people are really interested in this moment around Black talent, and particularly, again, senior Black talent. And I believe that a part of the reason for that is a part of the reason that people are looking for this talent, obviously, is to fill the gaps. But because when you think about retention, when people don't see leaders in the seats that look like them, it says there's no path for me. Right. So everybody's kind of rushing to kind of fill those senior roles. But the reality is that there are only so many of us to go around. And like there are literally, people are getting 5 job offers in 3 weeks time. And so, there's a question that someone posed. I'm gonna raise up. We have about 15 minutes left. Dermot O'Mahony sent a question in. And the question is, I'm going to read exactly what he said. And I love that he started with speaking truth to power, which we love to do. How do you navigate your relationship with clients in ensuring that they change their perceptions in hiring people they've never worked with before? So Moula, I'll start with you on that one. Because obviously being in the search space, how do you get these corporations or companies to think differently about candidates?
It's a very good question from Dermot. And I think I don't want to leave the perception that transformation is an issue that is only an issue for Black people, that Black people are the only people responsible for hiring Black people. Because if I look at my country and I look at the private sector, then we would never get anywhere. So I think sponsorship and transforming is a human issue. It's not a Black or white issue. It's an issue for all of us, regardless of race. And so when you say, how do you get, speaking truth to power, how do you get companies to begin to broaden the skill set? I really think it boils down a lot to just exposure. And if I look at it from a typically South African perspective, which could be very different from East Africa or West Africa, is that we were segregated in this country for so long. So we were really never exposed to living together. We never went to school together. We never grew up together. We never played sports together. So we othered each other for a very, very long time. So when I look at particularly Johannesburg, which is really the economic center of the South African economy, from an integration perspective, our children go to school together, they have sleepovers together, they play together. So there's a heightened level of exposure across races that never happened before historically. And so I think perceptions then begin to change, because if little Johnny can play with Sipho, and Sipho actually comes from a good family, even though I've never known the family before, we begin to change perceptions in terms of making sure that that little Johnny, who is Sipho's friend, maybe Sipho deserves an opportunity to get a job when he gets older, because he's played with my kids, he's slept over, I get to know him. And so I think transformation really is not just limited, in my country particularly, to just the corporate space, but also us living and working together. And then we begin to sponsor it and realize actually that at the end of the day, we all need each other, and it works for all of us to support and grow these big companies together. And if I look at the difference, particularly in South Africa, there are two different, we're one country, but two different countries. So if I look at Cape Town as a country, and it's not a country, it's a city, and I look at Johannesburg as a country, and it's not a country, it's a city, there couldn't be more different. So from a race and gender perspective, Cape Town is probably one of the most alienating cities in my country around race and gender, where Black people systemically, even in this day and age, find it very, very difficult to work in corporate South Africa and to succeed in corporate South Africa. Boil it down to the fact that from a socioeconomic perspective, the integration in Cape Town is so backward in terms of what happens in Johannesburg. So we still live in such, we never really integrate socially or otherwise. And so the integration is not just in terms of commercially integrating, but just in terms of growing up, living as neighbors, going to school, playing sports, eating together. Cape Town is one of the most beautiful cities in the world, but one of the most difficult and most painful cities to live in as a Black person. Having gone to university there, and I look at my children who are now at university now at 23, my experience 20 years ago and their experience 23 years later is no different, and it's the same city. And so I think that whole issue of sponsorship and getting companies to transform, I really think lies quite fundamentally in just the ability or the opportunity for people to live together across race, to be able to grow up together across race, to be neighbors and to eat and break bread. And I think that then begins to create a harmonious environment for us to think, if we can live together and eat together and play together, then maybe we can work together.
Awesome. So Valerie, I'm going to throw that to you, but with a twist. A slight twist, nothing too crazy. But I wanted to ask you that same question about how you navigate your relationship with your clients, because you have a number of clients all across the space, and ensuring that they change their perceptions and hiring people they've never worked with before, except that you have a very interesting data model, right? And I suspect that a part of that for you would be how you use that data. So can you answer that question, but kind of talking about your data model and why that's important and why people need to go to the data? And I'd really like you to go over again what the data is, because again, I think people have been looking at the wrong thing in terms of trying to measure. So if you can answer it that I'd be grateful.
Right. Well, I want to start by saying that, back to Dermot's question too, how do you penetrate clients that aren't used to seeing you? I think it comes back to the leaders within the organization. Sometimes they have to make the intro of us. They have to make it clear to the client that this is our guy, right? And I think that sort of it's a segue into your question specifically for me, and that is, I don't market what I do. Thank goodness I haven't needed to. But when one CEO sees my data model, it's very easy for them to mention it to their friend, and next thing you know, my phone is ringing from that, right? So I think the data model proves itself, and it becomes the thing that one CEO will say to another CEO. That's how I've gotten all of my business. So what's the data model specifically? So most organizations are looking at people data in silos. And maybe it's 7 different systems in looking at the collection of data. What we do is we ask our clients we've created a proprietary template that asks for data that stretches across the locations. If I think of, again, I come back to the one that's fresh in my mind because we just did the CEO readout this morning. We had everything from, we don't take any names, no personal identifying information. All that information is masked, but it's everything from the person's title, movement, length and current role, who their boss is, what their talent rating is, what their boss's talent rating is, exit interview information, culture information, talent tags, any information that the organization has on its people. We take that information and basically conjoin it to tell a story. And I can dig into the data in the matter of a 2-week period of time on average and come up out of that data and tell a CEO exactly what's happening with any talent, but we focus on Black talent in the organization. And for instance, I can tell a CEO immediately what their recruiting practices are and how Black people are disadvantaged just by looking at their recruiting practices, right? Where are the applications coming from? How many of the Black applications are not getting a look? By the way, that usually dispels the myth very quickly that there's no Black talent, because I recall showing one CEO for one particular job. He's like, Valerie, like, we couldn't find any Black people. Well, here's 690 people who applied for that job that didn't get past your recruiters, right? You can take that on through the process and say, some of our clients have very sophisticated diverse slate information, diverse panels information. Like, we can draw the corollaries for them that say, here are the businesses within your organization that are focused on diverse slates. So therefore, their conversion rates are higher because they're using a diverse slate. And here are the businesses in your organization that did not have diverse slates. By the way, they also did not have diverse panels. And that's why they converted, less than 1% Black people. By the way, usually what happens is when they see that analysis for Black people, they want it for other people too, because when the practice doesn't work for one group, it doesn't work for any. It's just more acute for Blacks because no matter where we go, Blacks are the least represented. We can tell an organization, I've done this plenty of times because it's a recurring theme, where Blacks are consistently rated lower performers across the board than any other population of people. If you look into the talent systems, what areas do those typically happen, right? Leadership might be one. So I say, companies will tell me that, Valerie, we have great data. Our data is phenomenal. We're looking at the data, until they meet us and they realize that they may be getting data, but they're not gathering any information out of the data that gives them actionable things that they can do to solve the problem. And I think that's really the differentiator of our data model, right? I'm going to point you exactly to the top 5 places that you need to look to solve your Black challenge inside your organization. And let me close by saying, I have not been in an organization yet where Blacks are not bringing up the rear on every dimension. Not yet. Well, and when a company tells me that we think they have it down, okay, let me come in so I can prove you wrong.
And that's, that's refreshing to have those data points, but painful to hear them. I mean, it's refreshing because we know that there's work to be done and that we can say, this is what it looks like and here's what we do. But it's also depressing that we're still having this conversation in 2020 in this way, and that we haven't been able to move forward. I mean, I think, again, and I, not to belabor the point, but the death of George Floyd sparked a whole lot of conversations that needed to happen, that we've been yearning to have. But I think it's important to also understand that, it took us 400 years in the U.S. at least to even get to the point where we can have the conversations we're having now societally. And then we have an expectation to have them in organizations as if they have the toolkit to do that. And so there's a lot of work to be done.
And in India, I would also say to you that, again, coming back to the beginning of the conversation, the CEO that wants to make change but may not know what to do, taking a data analytical approach, oftentimes, I would say 99% of the time that I have been in the experience with a CEO that fits that characterization, when they see diversity presented to them in the same way any other business is presented to them, using data and scorecards and metrics about the experience, not just representation, which is the outcome, they all say, oh my gosh, how come I didn't know this, right? So I think we have to give these leaders more than just the traditional diversity reports. We have to give it to them in a way that they know how to look at everything else.
Absolutely. So on that note, we have 2 minutes. Moula, I'm going to close with you. At the beginning, we had some sound issues, I think, when you were talking about your history and what you did. So I'd like both of you to do, though, and we'll take a minute. But first, Moula, if you can just repeat, because I want to make sure everybody heard it, who you are, your company that you're in now, and just a quick bit about your history. I would love that, because I want to make sure everybody heard it, because I'd like for people to know where to contact both of you, considering, what you do in these spaces, and that whilst, Moula, you sit in South Africa, you're well known in a number of places, not just South Africa, East Africa, West Africa, the UK. I mean, there's lots of places. So I'd like to be able to just do that, if you would, just for a moment, just kind of remake sure everybody heard who you were. And Valerie, I'll do the same with you in just a moment. I know people did, but I just like to make sure I close with people knowing where to find you and who you are.
Thanks, India. So I currently run as an executive search company or advisory company. We have 4 major competencies. I think the first one is executive search. We do work at board level and senior executive level. Executive assessment. So we assess executive teams, look at how well they work together, both in terms of technical competence and also just in terms of team synergy. We have a coaching business, so we focus on executive coaching. And those are I think the 3 areas: executive search at board level, executive level, coaching, and assessment. Our work is really quite international. We have an office in London, we have an office in Bordeaux, we have an office in Ghana, we have an office in South Africa. And we support, I think, a lot of companies that are looking to find diverse talent to bring, particularly on the African continent. My passion is the African continent. So doing work across East Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa is really what I really, really love, both across phone and Lusophone Africa, which is why we have an office in Paris. And one of my main partners, Bertrand, sits in France. And that's what we really do love. We love to do. Most companies, obviously, the whole issue of localization in Africa is big. The days of bringing in expatriates to change the fortunes of Africa, I think, gladly are behind us. So we're looking for Africans to bring back onto the African continent, most of them sitting in Europe or in the US, for them to really come home and begin to change the fortunes of their own countries. So there's a lot of work that we do, particularly for multinationals that want to find African to run their companies. And so diversity, I think, in terms of nationality, in terms of race, in terms of geographic location, is something that I think as a company, as Drayton Glendower, is that something that we're passionate about and we focus on. And so that's what we do. And in terms of my background, I was a management consultant at Accenture for 8 years, which is where I started my career. So working for multinational companies, helping companies transform strategies and finding leaders to implement strategies is something I've done for good old 26 years, and something I'll probably do till my old age because it's something that I really, really, really enjoy doing. And working, I think, with companies that are wanting to push the envelope is what I do. I tend to say things as I see them, and it doesn't always go down well. But I find from an ethical perspective and in terms of working with great clients, because I think our job as advisors, whether it's myself, yourself, India, or Valerie, our job is to tell the truth. It's not to sugarcoat it. And it's to make sure that clients get to hear the truth, whether you present it anecdotally, analytically, or whichever shape or form. And our job is to make them uncomfortable, because if they're comfortable, change doesn't happen. It's to tell them the truth, make them uncomfortable, and hopefully we'll be able to speak truth to power, and we change the dials in whatever shape or form that we can.
Thank you so much for that. And Valerie, where can people find you? Just briefly, I know we're 3 minutes over, but where can people find you and Elloree Talent Strategies?
So www.elloreetalentstrategies.com is the fastest answer to that. You could also follow me on Instagram, or is the show. And we're in the business of advising CEOs using data to set diversity strategy. Very focused on now. We also do actual strategy work for companies, and then we also do some executive coaching, CEO as well.
Awesome. So ladies, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
This has been so wonderful. And just being able to hear, giving again people the opportunity to hear from the folks who are doing it every day is a real pleasure. So I thank you both for joining me. I'm going to give you back your time so you can go back to your busy work lives, I'm sure. And I'm just going to close with a message to all of you who've watched today. Thank you for coming to and watching the Town Hall Summit. We had a great first panel. Actually, fireside chat with me and Steve Hammond. Then we had the first panel, which was the C-Suite Spotlight. Best in Class, we had the wonderful documentary, part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow. Please come back and watch part 2. The young people are equally as amazing. And we're closing today with the myth, hard to find diverse talent. Thank you all for joining me. I will see you tomorrow. Moula, Valerie, have a great day. Everybody have a great day. See you tomorrow.
You too. Thank you. Bye, Moula. Bye-bye.
Bye.